education inequalities. Mthobisi's PhD research explores the role of academics in higher education's contribution to the public good at 2 universities in South Africa. And his title is The Transformation Imperative, what it could mean to be a public good academic in post-1994 South Africa. Mthobisi, there are people in the audience, I think that they already know what you have been working on, and they are eager to hear the progress that you have made in your project. So you are going to have 30 minutes to present, and then thereafter, immediately, Beta is going to respond. Beta is our discussant today. So after Beta has responded to your presentation, the floor will be open to everyone to make their contribution, questions, and the suggestions for improvement. Without taking much of your time, I present to you, ladies and gentlemen, Mthobisi Ndaba. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for that introduction. So yeah, I believe many of you are quite familiar with my work because I think we have been in at least 2 conferences together where I presented my PhD at a proposal stage in the first one and a bit of data collection in the second one. So today I want to talk on a topic about the transformation imperative and just some of my thoughts about what it could mean to be a public good academic in post-1994 South Africa. As all of you know, or many of you know, that I've been doing research on higher education and the public good, looking specifically at the role of academics in higher education's contribution to the public good in South Africa. And so since the early 1990s and the early 2000s, this concept of the public good has been at the center of debates about the purpose of higher education. But when we look at the relationship between higher education and the public good, they're very, there's a lot of contestations about what that means in particular contexts. So in the literature that I've engaged in, I have seen that some are looking at this relationship between higher education and the public good from an economics perspective. They present economically oriented understandings that relate to, that speak about the role of higher education in economic growth and development. And others look at it from a human development perspective or the capabilities approach, which I think many of you would be very much familiar with that because you are doing quite a lot of that work in your center. But then others are looking at it from a socio-political or socio-politically oriented perspective that looks at democratization, addressing inequalities and issues that are related to that. And in my study, I had quite a lot of issues with this because these views or this literature that speaks to the relationship between higher education and the public good actually debates and analyzes this relationship at a macro level, looking at how higher education systems in different countries and institutions within those systems, how are they contributing to the public good? What is it that they are doing for the public good? And this macro level view mainly provides quite an abstract understanding of this relationship and does not give us much insight into the micro level dynamics of what happens in higher education in practice. And some of the literature that does engage with this micro level view of the relationship between higher education and the public good mainly focuses on students' experiences, which gives one side of the story, the benefits that should and can be derived from higher education as a public good and higher education for the public good. And this raises some questions for me. What about what it takes to produce those benefits? What about what it takes to make this public good contribution in terms of the perspective of those who are involved in the processes that produce about this public good contribution of higher education? So those are some of the questions that this raises, and these questions for me direct us to the other side of the story, which I find to be somewhat missing in the literature. And that's the side of the story that tells us the intricacies of the relationship between higher education and the public good at a micro level, at the level of practice. And this side of the story, I believe, is very much important in deepening our understanding of this relationship, particularly in the context of South Africa, which is characterized by colonial and apartheid legacies. And that creates a context that is a bit different from where many of the people who are writing about this relationship are writing from. So in my PhD study, I tried to explore this macro level view of the relationship between higher education and the public good. And what I tried to look at is how academics in South Africa understand the concept of the public good as it relates to higher education. I tried to look at what are some of the roles that academics play in higher education's contribution to the public good and the conditions that make that contribution possible. And in exploring these issues, I did so from the perspective of academics as people who are at the coalface of processes involved in higher education's contribution to the public good. So I interviewed about 15 academics of different levels of seniority in from different disciplinary backgrounds. And I must say at this point that the range of disciplines that were represented in my sample was not as wide as I would have loved it to be, because it was quite challenging to get academics to participate. And if you have done research with academics, you would know what I'm talking about. So I ended up using Snowball as one of my sampling methods, which then kind of gave me a sample of academics who are moving in somewhat similar circles and are also interested in similar issues. And that is somewhat reflected in some of the findings that I have in my study. And I will look at that as I continue with my presentation. So these academics that I interviewed were from two universities in South Africa. One is a historically white university, which I call Yellowwood University, and that's a pseudonym that I use. And I use pseudonyms for both universities and also for the academics, as you might see as I continue with my presentation today. And then the other one is a historically black university, and I refer to it as Protea University. There is really no particular reason why I chose these words. I just thought, you know, they would work as pseudonyms. So in having collected this data and interviewed these people, there were some key and interesting findings. At least they were interesting to me, and I'm hoping that they would also be interesting to you. I found that academics' understanding of the public good and its relationship to higher education is strongly influenced by the transformation imperative of the democratic dispensation of South Africa, which emphasizes redressing the injustices of the country's colonial and apartheid past through redress, social justice, inclusivity, reduction of inequality, alleviation of poverty and unemployment, amongst other things. And this is seen as being achieved through ensuring access with success to higher education, which is seen as itself a public good, and also skills development, ensuring social mobility, especially of those who are coming from historically marginalized portions of the population. And as I've said earlier, also looking at the contribution of higher education to economic growth and development, and also through the kinds of initiatives that universities engage in through community engagement, and also in terms of the kind of contribution that universities can do through knowledge production. But all of these things, in the way that my participants spoke about, they point towards the transformation imperative, the role that higher education plays in transforming the society and in the transformation of higher education itself and its institutions. So I also found that there's a particular set of personal attributes of academics, which in my study I refer to as attributes of a public good academics, that are seen by participants of this study as one of the conditions of possibility for higher education's contribution to the public good, especially in the South African context. And that relates to my question about the conditions of possibility. So these attributes is what I want us to focus on in my presentation today. And they include progressiveness, reflexivity, critical and political consciousness, social competence, and having an understanding of and a commitment to your civic responsibility as an academic working in a public university in South Africa. So in this paper, what I'm trying to argue is, in discussing these personal attributes of academics, I'm trying to argue that these attributes have implications for how we think about what it could mean to be a public good academic, or an academic who's committed to serving the public good in the South African context, and how we think and understand the public good role of these academics in a context where the public good is understood in terms of the transformation imperative. And the first of these implications is that these attributes that came out of this data, or that emerged from this data, they tell us that academics' personal attributes matter and cannot be ignored in our thinking about the role of academics in the South African context. And secondly, it suggests that debates, policies, and practices that are concerned with the transformation of the academic staff of universities in South Africa need to look beyond just their social identities, particularly the issue of race and gender. And many of us would know there has been a lot of debates about the underrepresentation of academics of color in the academy generally, and also in South Africa, given our country's history. And there has been quite a lot of initiatives to try and transform the academy, looking at initiatives like the NGAP and some mentorship programs that are happening within these universities. And sometimes when we think about the transformation of the academic staff, it's always about bringing more Black people into the academy. And my argument in this paper is that we need to look beyond just their social and their social identities in terms of race and gender. We're bringing more Black people, we're bringing more women into the academy. But we also need to look at their personal attributes, which do matter, as my study suggests, in the extent to which they contribute to the public good, which in this case is defined as related strongly to the transformation imperative of the post-apartheid dispensation. So one of these qualities or attributes is that of progressiveness. And this theme emerged quite strongly in the data I collected at Yellowwood University as a historically white university. So academics who serve the public good were described as progressive in that they advocate for transformation, not only within the borders of the university in terms of the transformation of the university itself, but also in the society beyond, through their different roles, whether it is through their research or through their political activism or public intellectualism, or their role as lecturers, and also through community engagement, which is one of the key performance areas for academics in South Africa. And so part of this progressiveness includes the idea of having a long-term vision for an alternative future, a transformed higher education system, and a transformed society. And not only just having that vision, but contributing towards the realization of that vision. And I have on the slide some of the quotes of academics who spoke about this, where academics have certain academics in these universities, especially Yellowwood University as a historically white university, are seen as progressive and socially conscious because of how they speak out about the injustices and the inequalities and the need for transformation in this university as a historically white university. So, and in one of the quotes, Prof. Jones, who is at Yellowwood University suggests that progressive, socially conscious academics are the ones who are at the forefront of the struggle for transformation at Yellowwood University as a historical white university. And one of the academics at the same university identifies himself as one of these academics with a long-term vision for transformation of the university. He says he calls himself progressive and not a reactionary. He calls himself as a revolutionary because he tries to be progressive in his thinking, and not only that, but also in his practice. So academics who are described as progressive are those who are seen to be supportive and also actively participating in initiatives that are aimed at transforming the university and bringing about transformation beyond the university. And these academics were contrasted with those who were seen to be resistant to initiatives of transformation, particularly at Yellowwood University as a historical white university. And given that I collected my data at a time where it was just after the nationwide protests done by the Fees Must Fall movement, there was quite a lot of examples of how some academics were seen to be against the students, and those were described and deemed to be not progressive because what the students were seen to be doing was trying to bring about transformation and restoring the public goodness of the university in terms of access, in terms of decolonization, in terms of ensuring that the university is accommodating to the diversity of the public that it serves. So that is why this characteristic of being progressive as an academic was seen as quite an important one in thinking about the role of academics in the post-apartheid dispensation. And the other one, which was also important, was that of reflexivity. So public good academics were also said to be reflexive in their practice. And for participants of this study, this idea of reflexivity is about thinking critically about and questioning one's own practice as an academic, particularly in terms of teaching and also in terms of research, as a way to improve and make sure that what one does as an academic serves the public good. So just some examples of these ideas. Mr. Dan, who is a physics lecturer at Protea University, spoke about reflexivity as what leads to self-improvement for academics. And that self-improvement was understood as learning from reflecting on one's own practice. And he says it is only through reflection that you can learn from mistakes and even from successes as well. So academics are expected to learn by reflecting on their own practice and using whatever lessons they learned from that process of reflection to improve their practice. But the essence of this idea of the value of reflexivity as an academic was best expressed in a comment by Ms. Randera, who is an education lecturer at Yellowwood University. She believes that through being reflexive as a lecturer, she learns in the process of teaching. And this is what she says. I've had to look deeply into my own processes of thinking about myself and my students and what that means. It's rewarding because I'm also learning as I am in the process of teaching. So at the heart of this notion of reflexive practice is the idea of drawing lessons from looking back into one's own practice as a way of improving and ensuring that one's practice in terms of pedagogy, in terms of research and knowledge production is contributing positively to society and therefore contributing to the public good. And then there was also the view that public good academics in the South African context have to be critically and politically conscious to contribute substantively to the public good as conceptualized around the transformation imperative. And this was mainly understood as being aware of students' realities and the needs and their needs, and also acting in ways that consider these experiences and needs, being aware of injustices and also acting against those injustices within the university. And this comes from the fact that post-1994, there has been an increase in the enrollment of students from disadvantaged backgrounds, which in the early years of the post-apartheid dispensation would be seen as non-traditional students, and they have been called disadvantaged students or students from disadvantaged backgrounds, which come from backgrounds that maybe somewhat underprepare them for university education, and they come with certain challenges and certain needs that the higher education system in South Africa is not really accommodating. So academics who are going to contribute to the public good, they are said to have to be critically and politically conscious. They have to understand those realities and the injustices that come with the legacy of apartheid and colonialism that continues to characterize the higher education system in South Africa. So, one example comes from Dr. Getz, who is an anthropology lecturer at Protea University, who described critically conscious academics as those that can see the structure and be willing to act on it when the possibility of struggle arises or exists. And this was spoken about mainly in terms of how some academics were not in solidarity with the students when there was police brutality on campus, when there were issues around decolonization of the curriculum, where there were issues around widening access through the provision of free education and all of those kinds of transformation issues that were raised by the Fees Must Fall movements and movements like the Roads Must Fall movement. And so others spoke of this element or attribute of critical and political consciousness in relation to their own positions and privileges that they have because of their race and the country's racist past, using those privileges for the public good and acting in ways that does not abuse these privileges but uses them to benefit others. So but this came particularly from one of the white academics I interviewed, who spoke about how they themselves benefited from the injustices of the country's apartheid past in terms of the quality of education that they received as white students and the opportunities that opened up to them to even go study abroad. And they felt that in the post-apartheid dispensation, those kinds of benefits that they received because of the country's racist past, they need to use them to benefit the rest of the population by investing it in developing students and contributing basically to the public good. So this idea of consciousness kind of echoes Paula Freire's notion of critical consciousness, who speaks about this critical consciousness as the awareness of unjust conditions, which then inspires action that will lead to liberation or that will lead to addressing these unjust conditions. So the idea here is that academics must be aware of the injustices, and not only that, but also take steps to try and address those injustices. So in the case of academics in the study, it was about being aware of the colonial and apartheid history of our country and the injustices and inequalities that arise from the legacy of this history and the impact that it has on higher education and the experiences of students in higher education. But also it is this awareness might lead them, or these academics, to use their position to transform these conditions. And then the last characteristic is the attribute of social competence, which encompasses numerous factors. It encompasses caring about students, it encompasses humility, it encompasses compassion, and also the willingness to learn. And I'll discuss these in detail just now. So as a public good academic, or a public good academic was described as someone who cares, especially about students and about people in general, because the idea of contributing to the public good was associated with doing something not for one's own self, but doing something or being committed to the well-being of others. And in order to have that commitment, one needs to care about those people, care about the students that they teach, and care about the society that benefits from the work that they do. And this caring was seen or understood to be demonstrated in teaching, and also in the way that as a lecturer, you recognize the students in front of you and you value them. You demonstrate that you value them. But also this notion of caring, of a caring academics, was more prominent among academics from Protea University, which serves the majority of its student body is students who are coming from disadvantaged background, and they have so many of these difficult challenges, issues of student hunger, issues of financial problems, even though those are widespread in South Africa. But historically, Black universities has the majority of students who are experiencing those kinds of challenges. So this ethics of caring as an academic was also demonstrated in how academics would be going beyond the call of duty to help these students. And some of the examples included how some of the academics used their monies to help students who are struggling to get transport money to school, who might not have food and some of their basic needs. And there were quite a number of examples that came up because of the issue of student hunger that seems to be quite a big one at Protea University. So one of the professors, Professor Aaron, who's an economics professor at Protea University, argued that to be a public good academic, you should care about the people, otherwise you should not be in the game. So otherwise you should not be an academic if you do not care. And then there was also this element of empathy and compassion, where both of these characteristics are somewhat similar, but they're also different, an aspect of what I call social competence in my study. And they were both identified by participants at both universities as necessary qualities for academics to serve the public good. And these are characteristics that were seen as what moves academics to take actions to help, especially helping disadvantaged communities through community engagement initiatives. And also the students that they teach, they must be able to empathize with them and in their interactions with the students who are experiencing different types of issues because of their disadvantage as well. And so that was the part of empathy and compassion. But then there was also the idea that the public good academic must be patient, and that patience is seen as that they must have an eye for talent and potential, but over and above that, they must be able to be patient with and deal with those students that might not be doing very well, that might not be performing very well in their classes, and they might be struggling. So it takes quite a lot of patience to be able to support those students so that they eventually get to a point where they're able to succeed in higher education, because the public good contribution of higher education is associated with not just access to higher education, but access with success. And that requires academics to be patient with the students that may not be performing well in their classes. And this is important in light of the inequalities that continue to be evident in the underpreparedness of some students for university education. And this is one of the things that contributes to access with success. And one example that was quite key for me in this aspect comes from Mr. Ndera, who is an education lecturer at Yellowwood University, who argued that in terms of the teaching project, it is important for academics to develop methodologies and pedagogies that respond not only to the best students in class, but also to the students who might be struggling. They must also respond to those who are not doing very well. So that's part of being patient with the students that are not doing well. And the last one is the element of humility, which comes from the view that academics do not have the monopoly of knowledge. So they must be humble enough to be able to learn from the students that they teach, because the students do not come into class as empty vessels, but they bring some degree of knowledge with them from their different backgrounds, which needs to be acknowledged in class. And even when you think about the communities that academics engage with in terms of community engagement or participatory action research or other sort of activities like political activism, they need to be humble enough and have the willingness to learn from those communities, because these communities are exposed to a part of the world that academics may not be exposed to. So having discussed this, all of these attributes are seen by academics in the study as what would position them to serve the public good better, especially in a context where the public good is strongly associated with the transformation imperative. With these characteristics, they are most likely to contribute to transformation. But my conclusion is that if higher education in South Africa is to serve the public good that is defined in this way in terms of the transformation imperative, it has to take transformation very seriously. And taking transformation seriously includes the transformation of the academic staff. And if that is going to be achieved, the transformation of academics should be about more than just their social identities. It should not be about bringing more Black academics and women academics into the academy, but it should also take into consideration whether the personal attributes of these academics are in line with the vision of a higher education that we want to create, which is in this case a transformed higher education that is seen to be contributing significantly to the transformation of society as a whole. Therefore, these personal attributes do matter. Whether the list that I discussed is the actual list of attributes that are important for the public good contribution of higher education in South Africa is really a different case. And in this paper, I'm not really arguing that this is the correct list. But the point I'm trying to make is that we cannot ignore personal attributes of academics in our thinking about the role that they need to play in the transformation of the academy and ultimately the contribution of higher education to the public good. So we have a lot of research on graduate attributes and the types of graduates that we need to produce as a country, but we really don't have much about what kind of academics can help to produce the type of graduates that we want to produce. And I think that the findings of this study in terms of these attributes is kind of a step to the right direction in terms of helping us think about what it would mean for one to be a public good academic in South Africa, a country that is characterized by the legacy of colonialism and apartheid and high levels of inequality that are inherited from the country's past. So we need to take into consideration these types of personal attributes, whatever they might be, and there has to be research that kind of explores this. And this is one of the things that gives us an insight into the micro level dynamics of the relationship between higher education and the public good, because it makes us to start looking at what it takes for higher education to contribute to the public good. What goes into that contribution to the public good? So I think I'm going to stop here. I think I've taken a bit more time than allocated, but yeah, I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Mthobisi. Better now is yours.
Can I go ahead?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much for your presentation. And congratulations on how far you have come up with your research. I remember last time we talked about this idea during the PhD conference in our public group in 2018 and 2019. So it has been really fascinating today to hear and see how far your research has developed. So good job and all the best with your submission. Well, I think this is a very significant research that tries to argue for the broader role of higher education, arguing for the public good role of higher education in South Africa. I actually find it more fascinating drawing from the academics to see how it could mean to be a public good academic. And to think about the academics, it reminded me of what Julius Nyerere once said about teachers. So in August 1966, he made a speech on the power of teachers, where he talked about how important teachers can be in shaping the skills, attitudes, and ideas of the students and society involved. He made a comment that teachers can make or ruin our society. And I think this speaks to the wider significance of academics, either through teaching, research, or even community engagement. So I believe your study makes a huge contribution by making a case on what it could mean to be a public good academic. I also agree with one of your findings when you said higher education contributions to the public good is strongly associated with the transformation imperatives of the post-1994. So in a way, when we talk about the public good role of higher education, it doesn't necessarily mean that we are trying to abandon the past for the present, but instead we innovatively blend the history with the present in the interest of the future. And this is important because the literature shows, and I think you have mentioned in your presentation, that the public role of higher education aimed to address issues of inequality, widening participation, civic responsiveness, public good professionals, and so on. Therefore, in as much as this is important in South African context with its complicated system, I think it doesn't limit to other contexts, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. So when we talk about the public good role of higher education, we basically call for a higher education system that leaves no one behind and enhance the well-being for all. Well, I also have some questions, and yeah, that I'll need you to make clarifications. So you have talked about how important these academic attributes matter in achieving the public good role of higher education. And I was wondering if you have some suggestion on how we can then enhance how we can enhance this academic attributes in order to achieve or become the public good academics. And I remember in your introduction you spoke about macro and micro levels. Can you also please just explain more about that and how it is problematic and how your study is trying to address the micro and macro level problem? I'll also be interested to hear if you can say more or roughly a summary of the discussion that you had with these academics. I know you mentioned that you wanted to know how they define the public good. If you can speak more on the type of questions that you're asking them, and roughly like a discussion of how you spoke with these academics. Oh, yeah, that's from me. Thank you so much. Your mic is off.
I'm sorry about that. Thank you very much for these questions. And I think the first one is a bit of a difficult question, but yeah, let me start with the macro and the micro issues. So by macro level, I meant that the current literature looks mainly at higher education at a systemic level. What are higher education systems in different countries doing for the public good? And what higher education institutions like universities are doing for the public good. For example, they would speak about contribution to economic growth and development, and they would contribute. They will speak about creating or building a skilled workforce. But that still speaks about these issues at a very abstract and high level. That really does not speak to what it takes or what goes into doing and achieving those things, right? And then the micro level is about going into what happens on the ground in practice, looking at the tensions within these institutions, the fact that in order for us to, for example, to contribute to knowledge production, right? Knowledge that can be capitalized to increase the economic growth and development, there's tension between teaching and research, where research is valued more than teaching is. And sometimes academics have to conduct research at the expense of teaching. So the production or contribution to one form of the public good is happening at the expense of the other part of the public good, which is issues that we don't really get to understand when we look at it at a systemic level. I don't know if that makes sense. So I think part of the macro level is what Professor Walker has done in terms of looking at the public good professionals and the capabilities of that, which I think in one of the papers that I presented, I think it was at UCL, I was trying to push the same idea that as much as we're looking at the capabilities of public good professionals, what about the academics that are supposed to produce those professionals? Are we thinking about what kind of capabilities that they would have? Maybe somebody else might do a study that explores the capabilities of academics that will produce the types of graduates with the capabilities that we want. So that's basically what I'm trying to push with this macro level research. And how do they define the public good? As I said, their understanding of the public good is strongly associated with the transformation imperative, especially when it relates to higher education in South Africa. How is the higher education being transformed? Because higher education itself is seen as a public good. Therefore, those who access it must access a higher education that is accommodating to the diversity of the public it serves. Because as we know, the country's history has shaped higher education in such a way that it serves the minority. And if that was not the case, we would not have had things like the roads must fall, the fees must fall, open studies, and all of those kinds of movements that are trying to say we need to transform our higher education, not only in terms of the curriculum, even though there's quite a lot that has been said on the decolonization of the curriculum, the indigenization of the curriculum, but also in terms of institutional cultures that need to accommodate the experiences of the diversity of students that are in that. So there's quite a lot that they say, but they speak about those things in relation to ensuring access with success, producing knowledge, not knowledge for the sake of it, but also knowledge or applied knowledge for a particular end that will contribute to economic growth and development, that will contribute to addressing our social issues. And there was quite a strong emphasis about locally relevant knowledge. And those are some of the things. I don't know if I am touching to your question, but the question of how can we enhance or produce these attributes, I think that is also a whole new PhD that I would have to do I think that the point that I'm just trying to push in this case is that these attributes matter. Maybe academic development practitioners who are working with academics need to think about curriculum and mentorship programs that tries to inculcate these values of reflexivity, these values of that are in line with our vision of a higher education for the public good. I hope that really makes sense, but I still don't know. I can't really say for sure that this is how we can address or try to build these kind of attributes in academics.
Thank you so much. Can you also please say a little bit about the conceptual framework that you use to theorize your findings?
Okay, thank you very much for that. I used concepts that were building on the work that we were doing on the public good project in 4 African countries that you guys are most familiar with. That of instrumental public good and intrinsic public good that was developed as part of that project. So I used that, but I also drew a lot from people like Simon Marginson, also Professor Melanie Walker, and her ideas around public good professionals, and all of those kinds of scholars that have written quite a lot on public good or higher education and the public good. So I've been just trying to draw from those the different scholars to bring together what I was working on.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. The floor is now open to audience for questions. You can post the questions in the chat box or just unmute yourself and ask the question.
Carmen, do you want to go first? I don't know if anybody else has got the hand up. You can go first if you want.
Please go ahead. I will ask after you.
Oh, okay. Okay. Thanks very much. That's a really sort of rich, a rich presentation, and I think it's a really interesting study because I think you're absolutely right. Academics are neglected in this whole story, so I think that's kind of quite intriguing, and I accept that this might be something that you do as a follow-up study, but nonetheless I think it's an important issue. So what I've been thinking about as you present are sort of a cluster of things, and I'm going to try and make sense of them. So and they sort of fit together, I think. So the one is around, and I think one has to think about the institutional conditions of possibility as well as these personal attributes. So do you have a sense of how these sort of bottom-up micro-level actions and attributes might add up to institutional change? So you've got lots of disparate individuals doing these amazing things. How does that begin to add up to something which we might understand as institutional change? That's the one curiosity. And then related to that, and again, I accept this might not be something your study can answer, but it's an interesting question. What then would be the institutional, the policy, the contextual and historical conditions that make this kind of public academic possible? And then the third and last one is that these attributes are presumably dynamic. They're personal, but they are socially and relationally formed. They will develop and change over time. So were you kind of, and of course you've taken a point in time, and you might want to go back to the same people further down the line and see what else they're doing. But I wondered if you asked them how they came to hold the values that they do. I mean, the attributes are kind of an operationalization, as it were, of the values, but something like a value where you bring a commitment to a particular kind of political change. So, sorry, I don't know how coherent that is, but I think it's a really, really nice study. So, well done.
Thank you very much for those questions. Yeah, I think it might be something that I really explore further after this. But just to start with the last question in terms of how they came to hold the values that they do. So as I said earlier, it was quite difficult to get academics to participate. So I ended up with people that kind of move in the same circles. That was sort of a disadvantage in that I could not get a wide range of views, but it was also an advantage in a sense that it gave me an in-depth understanding of how this group of people are thinking about. So most of them had been involved in political activism before they became academics, number one. Number two, others are still involved in political activism, even right now through their research. They have tried to kind of mix their political activism and research. So that is why they have strong views around issues of transformation. So I think most of them, that background in political activism is what kind of inculcated these values that speak to progressiveness and a commitment to transformation. So I think that's one of the things that contributed to these values. And in terms of the institutional conditions, I think that is something I would really have to think much more about it. I don't have a specific answer to it now. Maybe there has to be somewhat policies that are developed to kind of formalize and institutionalize these calls for transformation. And I think that's also something I just need to think a bit more about in terms of the institutional conditions. I do not know if I answered your question, but yeah, I don't have a specific answer for the part about institutional conditions.
That's fine. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mthobisi, for this great presentation. I really enjoy hearing about your study, and I think many of us align with your thinking. And we think that bringing those personal attributes of academics are quite essential, because it's not only about who we are as professionals, right, but also who we are as personals and professionals in a highly complex space of higher education in South Africa. So thank you for bringing that to our attention and to the academic community as well. I found a lot of value in it. I guess my question is just a comment more than a question, because when you were presenting the different levels in terms of progressiveness, reflexivity, critical and political consciousness, and socially competent, and the different subcategories, I was thinking, like, it seems to me that you have like two kind of levels. One that is more about a mental predisposition or a way of seeing the world and thinking about the world. And there is another aspect that is more action oriented, right? Like acting as a caring person, empathic and compassionate, having patience and so on. So if I see this classification in that division, I found a bit difficult to see what is the difference between critically and politically consciousness and socially competent. Because for me, I think perhaps they can be merged and then bring all these different subcategories. But yeah, I was thinking maybe to ask if you had a reason why they were separate, and your thinking behind this classification. So that's all. But thank you so much. I really enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you very much, Carmen, for that comment. I struggled quite a lot with the same thing in my thinking and trying to organize how I engage with this data. But then my thought was around that critical and political consciousness is more towards political activism, whereas the part about social competence is more towards interpersonal skills, if I can put it that way, about how they interact with these students, and like soft skills, if I can put it like that. And I found it very difficult to then put them together, even though I could see that there might be some connections between the two. So that's why I ended up putting them separately. Maybe the phrasing of social competence might need to be thought through a bit more, because I think it does kind of maybe bring that confusion a bit. But that was just my thinking around it.
Thank you. Yeah, I can understand that it was a complex process of thinking to really divide into these categories. But yeah, that really makes sense. And yeah, because you see it more as a political activism, as you mentioned, and the other is more the relation with the students. Yeah, I was just thinking like maybe bring them more than separate categories as interrelated categories, because what I like about your study is bringing that personal attribute, but the personal is somehow together with the professional, right? So so yeah, so I was thinking like, okay, how you can bring both, you know, in a way that it highlights that they are not separate. We're human at the same time as we're lecturers or people working in universities. But that's just some comments that, yeah, if you want to continue thinking about it. But
thank you very much. That's very helpful.
Yeah, thank you. It was great to listen to you today.
And do you have a handout?
Can I go now?
Yes.
Thanks. Thanks, Mthobisi. I thought your study is really so interesting and your presentation was excellent. And I particularly appreciated your perspective of, you know, how strong the focus in higher education is on graduate attributes, and yet we ignore the people who are actually responsible for doing that. My question is really, I'm interested to know the extent to which privatization in higher education is influencing, firstly, the public good role of higher education from academics' perspectives, if you were able to determine that, and secondly, the public good attributes amongst academic staff themselves.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. I must say, in my study, I do not engage at all with private provision of higher education. So the focus was mainly on public universities. And of course, there are quite a lot of debates around whether private universities or private institutions are contributing to the public good as they should. However, I think looking back at some of the work that we did in the Public Good Project, there was a view that these universities or these institutions, private institutions, are contributing to the public good in the sense that they are producing skilled workforce, they are contributing to knowledge production through their research, but that sometimes get confused with the profit-making aspect of it, that the profit-making aspect of what they do might kind of override how they are doing in terms of the public good aspect of it. They may be more concerned about getting the numbers rather than ensuring that the graduates that they produce are fit for the labor market, for example. Or they might be more concerned about getting publications out rather than the substance of those publications. So those are some of the questions which I think also even our own universities, public universities, they also do that. You see quite a lot in terms of research that there is quite a lot of concern about publishing so that one does not perish, and it's more about how that will contribute to one's promotion, because research is valued more. So those are some of the intricacies of what happens in the micro level. But yeah, I do not engage a lot with the private provision, so I can't really comment much on it.
Yeah, thanks, Mthobisi. I think I agree with you about private institutions. My question was more specifically about the privatization within public universities and its impact on those academics.
Oh, okay, I see.
Sorry. Well, that's
yeah, no, that's a question I would have to think about as well. It's not something that I engaged with a lot, even though in the beginning of my study, I did somewhat consider issues around neoliberalism and the neoliberalization of the university and the capitalization of knowledge. So there is that element of privatization, and I think it's also putting a lot of pressure on academics, especially when it comes to issues of funding, because one of the things that academics have also are starting to be evaluated on is the ability to bring money to the university. So that's all part of this privatization issue and the neoliberalization of the university and the whole entrepreneurial university that is emerging. But I do not engage a lot on that with my study. But I know that Palesa, who is also part of the PhD cohort here at Riel, does quite a lot on the entrepreneurial university and the issues of privatization related to that. But yeah, I can't comment much on
yeah.
this.
Thanks, Mthobisi. It probably is another study in itself.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Mthobisi, for the wonderful presentation, and thank you, Betha, for your response, and all those that asked questions and made the comments. I think that will help Mthobisi to further think about the study. Unfortunately, we are out of time, so we are going to end here. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.